We'll move on to the next talk. Alyssa Marian is a lab manager and research technician for USCB's Marine Sensory and Neurobiology Lab. She's going to give a talk about the Lowcountry Dolphin Monitoring Project.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for having me. Hope everyone's still alive this afternoon after listening to all these wonderful talks. So today, earlier you heard from Dr. Monty, who's talked a lot about our Soundscape work and some of our water quality monitoring programs, and he kind of hinted towards the Dolphin program. So that is what I'm going to be focusing on this afternoon. Current methods to study bottlenose dolphins have largely relied on boat-based and aerial visual surveys, as well as telemetry and also drones. These methods are advantageous because they provide you with exact animal counts and can also give you some insight into their behavior at the surface of the water. More recently, however, scientists have begun to use passive acoustics monitoring. While it's not quite possible to give you exact animal counts, as Dr. Monty had mentioned earlier, it can provide greater temporal coverage, so we can sample for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with a very high duty cycle, and even in poor weather conditions that make these other methods impossible. Because dolphins are very vocal animals, we can gain insight into their behavior not only at the surface of the water, but also below the water. So we can learn about their spatial distribution and also tune into these key behaviors like foraging, mating, and social interactions. Our lab has used a combination of visual surveys and passive acoustics to create a really robust method to study the dolphins in our local estuaries. So our story begins all the way back in 2013. We began deploying these acoustic recorders at 6 different stations throughout the May River. These recorders were set to record sound for 2 minutes every 20 minutes. So this is a very high duty cycle. And from that, we were able to generate a ton of data. So what did we learn about dolphin acoustics in the May River? So here is just looking at one station of data. So this is our station located closest to the headwaters. On the x-axis, we have the date. So this is just data collected in 2013. And then on the y-axis, we have the sum of vocalizations per day. And this includes echolocation, which they use for foraging, burst pulse sounds, which are used for a lot of different social interactions like mating, and then whistles, which are used for identification purposes. So if we look at our station 4M, way up in the headwaters, you can see automatically that it's a very quiet station. We don't have a lot of dolphin vocalizations happening in this area. This same pattern is seen when we look at our stations 9M and 14M, still relatively towards the headwaters and both very quiet as well. However, when we begin to move further out in the estuary to our station 19M, which is right in the middle of the May River, we see this dramatic increase in the number of vocalizations that we're hearing. This is seen as we continue to move out to our next station, 34M, and right at the mouth of the May River in this lower right-hand corner is our station directly at the mouth. So if you look as we move from our stations at the headwaters that are very quiet, but then as we move out into the estuary, we begin to hear a lot more dolphin vocalizations with our station at the mouth being the loudest. It's also important to point out that echolocation, which is this dark blue color, is the most common vocalization that we hear at all of these stations. From here, while that was just 1 year's worth of data, we began to monitor these 3 stations, so 9M, 14M, and 37M, for a long-term study. So this first figure is showing you still the sum of vocalizations per day. However, this time we are looking at 6 years worth of data. So all the way from 2013 to 2019. If we look at our 2 stations, 9M and 14M, that are closer to the headwaters, we see that this pattern with our headwaters being very quiet in terms of dolphins continues across multiple years. Then when we jump to the mouth of the river at 37M, we again see this dramatic increase in the vocalizations. So not only can we tell that spatially, we hear more vocalizations at the mouth of the May River, but by monitoring these stations long-term, we can begin to tune into different temporal patterns. So if we look at the mouth of the river here at the bottom, we see this prominent pattern where vocalizations begin to increase in the late fall and remain greatest in the winter time. And then they decrease in the spring and are lowest in the summer. And this is something that we've seen for multiple years. So this is a pattern from here that we really wanted to key in on and try to understand why we're seeing this pattern. Does it have to do we have more dolphins in the estuary in the winter? Does it have to do with their prey? So really trying to understand these temporal patterns and why we see this at 37M, but not at these stations in the headwaters. To do this, we decided to expand our acoustic array. So in 2019, we added one station at the mouth of Chichessie Creek and one station at the mouth of Colleton River. So again, these figures are on very similar axes, so date on the x-axis, but this is giving you data from 2019 to 2021. And then we have sum of vocalizations per day on the y-axis. So right away, you can see that our station at the mouth of the Colleton River is much louder than Chichessie Creek in terms of dolphin vocalizations. If we look at Colleton River, interestingly, we see the same pattern that we see at the mouth of the May River, where vocalizations are higher in the fall, winter, springtime, and lowest in the summertime. So because this station seems to be operating in the same way as the May River, it's really important for us to move forward and really try to understand what is leading to this pattern that we're seeing. To do this, we need to bring in some of our visual survey data. So we have been conducting monthly visual surveys in the May River since 2016. And then we added a survey area in the Chichessie River, Chichessie Creek, Colleton River, and Okatee River in June of 2019. So on each one of these surveys, we are recording the number of animals we see, including the number of neonates and calves. We're also keeping a record of different behaviors that we observe, as well as doing photo ID. On our surveys, we are also monitoring water quality every time we see dolphins, and also at these various water quality monitoring stations throughout each survey site. So at these stations, we're keeping track of water temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and pH. So I mentioned that we do photo ID, so photo identification. We take a picture of each dolphin's dorsal fin, and these fins act as fingerprints for these animals. So all of these notches and nicks that they have on the edge of their fin allow us to run these pictures through a program called Darwin that will trace the outline of each fin and run it through a catalog of all the dolphins we've seen previously. So this allows us to keep track of how many dolphins we're seeing in the estuary and when we're seeing each individual. This allows us to determine the residency of our dolphins. So residents are dolphins that we see year-round in all seasons across multiple years. We have seasonal residents that are seen in the same season across multiple years. And then we have non-residents. So these are the dolphins that are seen in only 1 to 2 seasons. From our visual surveys in the May River, we've come to learn that we have a relatively small population of residents that are here year-round. So in the May River, we have about 30 individuals. And then we have a slightly larger population of seasonal residents, and then a much larger population of non-residents. This same pattern is seen in our newer survey area in the Chichessie Colleton. So we have a very small resident population, a slightly larger seasonal resident population, and a much larger non-resident population. It is important to point out that because this new survey area is relatively new, these numbers are likely to change as we do more surveys and have more years of data. It's very possible that these numbers will shift slightly, but so far they do seem to be following the same patterns that we observe in the May River. So who are these residents, non-residents? Where are they coming from? So to understand that, we need to take a look at the bottlenose dolphin stock structure along the East Coast. So we have 11 bay, sound, and estuary stocks here in these blue boxes. So these dolphins are in the estuary year-round, and these form our resident populations. We then have 3 different coastal stocks here in orange from South Carolina to Florida, and these dolphins spend time along the coast, but they don't make any sort of seasonal migrations. And then we have 2 very large migratory stocks that make very large seasonal migrations following water temperature each year, and they migrate all the way from New Jersey down to Florida. So these seasonal residents and non-residents in our estuary likely come from these coastal stocks and even possibly individuals from the larger migratory stocks. Looking at our abundances that we've observed in the May River, we can tell that we do have some sort of seasonal migration right away. So this figure is showing you the survey date on the x-axis and the number of dolphins sighted on the y-axis. So all of these peaks and valleys tell us that we do have some sort of migration of dolphins in and out of the estuary at different times of the year. If we look at this seasonally, we can see that in the spring and summer, we see more dolphins, and then we see very low abundances in the wintertime. One important thing I want to point out is that although we see very low abundances of dolphins in the wintertime, that is the time when we hear the most vocalizations. So there's something that is leading to this discrepancy between the number of vocalizations we're hearing and the number of dolphins that we're seeing. In order to describe this pattern and understand what's going on, we decided to look at the distribution of dolphins in the winter versus the summer. So on the left, we have a density heat map of sightings in the wintertime. So the warmer the color, the higher density of sightings. So in the winter, you can see that dolphins tend to congregate at the mouth of the May River. And this could have something to do with prey. So in the wintertime, when prey is scarce, perhaps dolphins are at the mouth of the river simply to find food. And this could explain why we hear more echolocation in the wintertime. Perhaps they're having to echolocate more just to find food. Alternatively, when we look at the summer, we see more high density areas throughout the river. So dolphins are more spread out. And this could be because prey is more abundant from the headwaters to the mouth in general. Although we have yet to really tease apart the density distribution in our new survey area, the Chichester-Colleton, we have compared abundances that we see in this area to the May River. So on the x-axis, we have the month, and on the y-axis, we have the number of dolphins that we sighted. And we do see the same seasonal pattern. So we have higher abundances in the summer and very low abundances in the wintertime. One more important thing that I really want to point out is that we do have dolphins that we see and have seen in the May River that we are now seeing in this new survey area. So this gives us some insight into the true extent of these animals' home ranges. So we know that their home range extends beyond just the May River or just the Colleton River. So the more survey areas we're able to do, the better understanding we can get of their home range. But so far, we do know that these dolphins are moving between the Calabogie Sound all the way to the Port Royal Sound. So this is a lot of information crammed into a very small amount of time. So I just want to bring us back to the key points and point out what we have learned with our dolphin program over the last 10 years. So using passive acoustics, we've really come to understand the repertoire of these dolphins in our estuaries. And we do know that there is more echolocation overall compared to burst pulses and whistles. We also know that there are more vocalizations at the mouth of these tidal rivers, and that these vocalizations follow different seasonal and temporal patterns. So we know that there's more vocalizations in the winter. We also know that there's more vocalizations at night and during low tides. From our visual surveys, we've come to understand the approximate abundances of dolphins in each of our survey areas, as well as understanding the influx of these migratory animals. And we know that we have more dolphins here in the late summer. We know that there are more dolphins at the mouth in winter, and that this could likely be linked to their prey. And we're understanding that these dolphins have a very extensive home range, and our surveys are just a tiny sample of what could be their true home range boundaries. We're learning that the carrying capacity of our estuary is changing seasonally and is different in the winter and the summer. And overall, we are seeing a generally healthy population of dolphins. We see very few emaciated animals or diseased animals. So where do we go from here? Well, the first step is really to understand this link between prey and abundance. Does the abundance of prey affect their vocalizations and their abundance? How is this linked to climate variability? Are there seasonal changes in the carrying capacity? Are there yearly variations? We also want to understand core use areas. So looking at the density, not only in the May River, but also our new survey area in the Chichester-Colleton, and how do they compare? Where are areas that are critical habitat for these dolphins and for foraging or mating? And then one component that I didn't really touch on in this talk is understanding the impacts of noise. So how does a really loud estuary like the Charleston Harbor that has more pollution, vessels, and noise, how does this compare to the more quieter areas like the Chichester? How does this affect dolphin vocalizations and their abundance? And then lastly, of course, there is so much more that we can learn from acoustics. Acoustics can help us key into the exact timing of this change in vocalizations in the wintertime. We can identify signature whistles of residents, so be able to identify our residents using acoustics, and also understand the differences in the acoustic repertoire of our residents and our migrants, which will help us determine the seasonal arrival of migrants based upon their acoustic patterns. And then of course we can key into different behaviors. So we could look at echolocation, for example, and whether or not an echolocation bout signifies a successful foraging event. And this list could really go on and on for acoustics. There's so many questions that we can answer. Every time we answer one, it seems like we come up with 10 more that we want to ask. So it is a really powerful tool. And with that, I would just like to thank Dr. Monty, of course, our fearless leader, as well as Aga and Bradshaw, our previous field and lab managers, as well as the multitude of undergraduate students, graduate students, interns that have really kept this long-term program going. It really does take a village, and it wouldn't be possible without all of these people, as well as NIMS for our dolphin permit. So that allows us to go out there and do these visual surveys. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge all of our funding sources. This long-term program would not be possible without all of these organizations. So we just want to say thank you for supporting our work. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa. We have a question. Are you tracking reproductive success? I noticed you had some recordings of calves in your survey data.
I don't know with our visual surveys if we could necessarily track reproductive success, but we can, by monitoring and recording the number of neonates, so essentially newborns that we're seeing, we can definitely key into the specific timing of their mating seasons.
I know this is for dolphins, you need a long-term data set that's even longer than you have in terms of looking at survivorship. How long does a newborn dolphin stay with its mother to know whether or not it reached an age that it could be independent?
So they can stay with their moms anywhere from 2 to 6 years.
Okay. In other areas, the neonate mortality is high when they have instances of pollution. Have you seen any evidence of sick newborns or other sources of mortality?
We actually haven't. We've seen very few dolphins that have any sort of anything suggesting that they're diseased or ill. So that's very good. Every once in a while, we'll have a dolphin that has what's called a peanut head. So right after the blowhole, it will kind of have a dip, and that suggests that they're emaciated. But again, we see very few of those animals. So it's likely that our dolphin population is overall very healthy.
Which correlates with the results that Denise was showing in terms of looking at CCAPS data. So that's an interesting parallel. The second question is the Darwin database publicly available?
Yes, it is. I believe it's Eckerd College that we have adapted it from. And They have a paper about it and it is publicly available. It's a free program. There are other programs you can use that are paid, but this one is a free one.
Okay, and last question is, how do the fins get damaged to get all these different shapes?
So all of these different shapes and notches and nicks are essentially damage to the fin. So it's all scarring. So this can come from aggression with each other or even socialization. It can come from scraping on oyster beds. And we do see a lot of fishing and boat interactions. So entanglements, getting hooked on a prop. We see a lot of those as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you for having me.